And the recording will be uploaded to our website, the Faculty of Oriental Studies website. So it can be visible for everyone that weren't able to join us now. Okay, so I think we can start now. Again, I apologize for the delay, but as I said before, what is a seminar without technical problems, or in that case, human factor issues? So with great pleasure, I can introduce Professor Wolbert Smidt from the university, from Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, and Professor Wolbert is an ethnohistorian, and today he will talk to us. He will talk with us. He will present his ethnohistorical research in the highlands of Tigraj. So, with no further introduction, Wolbert, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's very interesting to be able to talk in this framework, and I'm also curious about the questions to come. First, about myself, I'm a professor, adjunct professor at Makerere University because of a long experience. By now, however, I'm a postdoc at Jena University, just to be precise, and I'm linked as a corresponding member with the German Archaeological Institute. We are cooperating, and I'm really lucky about it. It's a great chance. As a non-archaeologist, I'm cooperating with them in the framework of Jena University within the Yaha project. Yaha is the most ancient settlement, or more or less the most ancient settlement in northern Ethiopia, which can be linked with the Ethio-Sabaean period. For those who know the context, it's clear, but I don't need to go into more details here. So since many years, I'm cooperating with this project, and since 2 years, I'm linked with the project as a hired member, which is a wonderful chance. So my presentation now is also focusing on the things, on the research projects and research questions, which I developed within this cooperation. I'm now trying to, you have to allow me to share my screen, because I have, of course, my PowerPoint presentation. And for this, I think you must make me a host. Oh, co-host.
Now it should be okay.
Okay, yes, perfect. Very great. Now it's coming. You have seen the title in the invitation. It is very general. I'm giving basically an introduction into the topic. I'm speaking about both results and methods, questions of method in ethnohistorical research in the ancient highlands of Tigraj. Ethnohistorical research in the ancient highlands, this of course means that I'm not able to beam myself into the ancient societies 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago. But we have a very interesting set of methodological approaches which allow us to work within today's society and be able to grasp some aspects of how history is preserved, and in some cases also to identify elements of societal self-organization which are clearly ancient. We usually don't have a label, which archaeologists sometimes have due to C14. We usually don't have a clear label about which time periods we can sort of reconstruct. but due to comparison, methodological comparison with the archaeological record, with the historical record, in quite a number of cases, we are able to reconstruct somehow the time frame to which our findings are referring to. Let me first go into methodological and principle introduction of the main ideas, main observations. Just for your information, what you see here is the old temple and the church of Yaha. The temple is not very visible here, but this is the temple hill, and in front it's the church, which had been rebuilt over the centuries and probably over the millennia, over a very, very long time, it means, and plays a very central role in the local tradition. So my starting point and my focus is Yaha, which is the center of this ancient society about 2,800, 2,900 years ago, and densely settled since that time. But I will give examples from all over the region to illustrate my points. So now I start with the more principal remarks. Please, you don't need to read this text now. It's the abstract which you already know. I have put it there because people who may look at the recording may need to use this text as a reference. And I found it quite useful because it is summarizing the main ideas which I'm discussing now. Now let me start with the general remarks, which are very important, which are also sort of the theoretical layer of what we are doing. History is very often seen as a sort of objective set of facts, and the task of historical research is very often seen as based on methods to reconstruct these facts, and the very political and social function of history is to some degree underestimated. In modern times, of course, this is very well known, but I want to start with this observation that whatever history, if modern reconstructed history, reconstructed by professional historians, or a history told by local village people, whatever history we are talking about, it has an aspect, a social aspect, and a social political aspect, which we should not underestimate in its powerful influence on how we see history, how we interpret it. To be more concrete, every politically unified society, every political entity does not only have governance systems, not only legal systems, but there is more or less no society which does not have also a historical narrative system as a reference system. I'm sorry to use too much system, but I like the word in this context because it shows to which degree we are not just dealing with individual facts, scattered facts, dynamic chaos, which we are trying to reconstruct, but we have a certain approach to history, to historical facts, and to history telling, which is not just individual, not just submitted to power also, but which is a complex system of interaction between how we see facts, how we discover them, how we read them, and then how we narrate them. The historical past, may it be a past 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or be grounded in a mythical past. This historical past you find in form of quite different narratives in every society. It can be a narrative about the origin of the language. It can be a narrative about the founding fathers of a society. It can be a narrative about how the land came into the possession of a specific nation or population or ethnic group. This kind of patterns you find everywhere. And this is not accidental. This is what I want to say. This is highly important because if we look from this angle, we understand that the process of historical narrations is a process directly linked with the idea of history reinforcing a specific identity. We cannot separate it from identity, and I don't speak of cultural identity, I speak of social political identities, which also means identities which assure the functioning of institutions, social institutions, cultural institutions, and of course, power structures and power relations. This is important because if there is an institution, the institution works only because there is a general consensus that this institution has a sort of justification. It can be justification of violence feared by everyone in the same way or in a similar way. It can be justification because of a moral narration behind it. But in any single case, we do have an historical element in it. An institution has been founded or created, for example, by a founding father or by a government, which was legitimate, in contrast to maybe an illegitimate ruler who has founded his own institutions, but who had to be abolished in a revolutionary process or similar process, historical processes, which therefore are regarded to be historically unjust or historically unjustified. So we do not have only the justification of a positive approach to institutions, but we also have the justification of a rejection of institutions. And this is usually the institutions of something other. So this is again an important point. In this historical narration and construction of narrations, we do not have only the idea that the history of our entity, of our political entity, had been constructed by positive figures, but also by negative figures. And these negative figures play also a very important role in the sense of elements which allow us resistance which protects our society. It may be a resistance against invaders, sometimes imagined invaders, evidently. It may be a resistance against some undesired economic power increase of specific groups who are tolerated if they play a sort of equal role within society, but which will not be tolerated anymore if they grasp more power. So these negative narratives are not only narratives of resistance, but also narratives of creating a certain equilibrium, which allows these institutions to remain stable. So it is linked with values, social political values. I will now not go more into this. There's so much literature into it, but you got the point. For me, it is important to see our discussion of history not simply as a field within which we are reconstructing simply facts, but we are asking questions: what is important for us? What is important for our society? So we are in a process of choices. And this is what we do in our modern societies. If it's Germany, Poland, if it's Ethiopia, we all know this process. And it is extremely powerful in the definition of how we see history. Ethnohistory, and that's the point, knows that. Ethnohistory is taking this kind of processes as granted. Ethnohistory doesn't claim to have the perfect instrument to distill specific facts from an ancient or not so ancient past, and then finally have an instrument to objectively define specific elements of history. No. Every element of history, including facts which we can really reconstruct, have always this context of socio-political reference systems and social political need, and which also includes some processes of interpretation or even falsification. So I have to speak shortly about method. As you have understood, the method is not only focusing on the idea how can I distill what is objectively correct from what had been added by a subjective process. The method starts from the observation that the entire process has always a subjective element. By the way, and that's the important thing, as all history has. That's the important point. All history is a selection process also of objective facts. So I don't deny the existence of objective facts, but I want to underline the subjective interaction between the objective facts, the fragments of historical facts, and the process which makes sense of it. Making sense is the point about history writing and historical narrative. So what we do in ethnohistory is trying to describe this process, but what we also do is trying to look into those elements which give us good and helpful insights into how more ancient societies have been working. And here I come quite close, you will see some of my examples, quite close to the claim that we have sort of time windows in local traditions, local practices, which allow us to look into ancient societies, not at all like what we would wish, not in the sense of a time machine. Even the so-called the classical history with very solid documents, especially written documents, even this history cannot claim to have such a strong mechanism to understand the whole dynamics of a specific society at a specific time. Ethnohistory, however, also allows us these kind of time windows, and I will now move further into how it works concretely, so that not to convince you, but to show you how rich this field is. And I should say this is a field which has basically just started. There's a number of researchers of different backgrounds in anthropology, in archaeology, including ethnoarchaeology, for example, in linguistics, who are all contributing to this field. But I would say what we know today and what we may be able to know later is still worlds apart. So I would say we are just in a sort of very first phase of a potentially extremely interesting field, academic field. So just to make it clear, it is the typical and necessary character of historical narration that it is based on perspectives and a process of selection. Just to make it clear that this is really there. And there's usually a counter argument that with a set of quite well-proven, well-working instruments of analysis, we can close to objective history. I absolutely do not reject that we have some hierarchies of knowledge. Sometimes we really have very detailed insights. But what is very interesting, the choice of what we are interested in history, the choice of what we believe is important, is again part of the process. And the more we believe that these choices are right and important and necessary, the less we see the subjective element in it. The more we believe that finally we were able to write objective history. So I want to make clear that this mechanism is in any of our approaches to history. Now to the methods used by local people themselves. Because we as researchers are not the only ones who are looking for method how to preserve and how to come closer to history. What the local societies who are interested in history do is exactly the same. They're looking for methods. How can we be closer to historical knowledge and preserve it? And I just give you, I don't go into all details. It's sometimes quite technical. It's also linked with linguistic questions. But one interesting example are the oral historiographers, as I call them. Oral historiographers are a sort of I would almost say a traditional rank, or not a rank, but a traditional office in a very soft sense, a traditional office of local societies, especially societies which are not strongly submitted by a state system. So let me call it a traditional function of specific elders. There is the idea, and as you know, I'm working in northern Ethiopia, in Tigraj, so I'm referring to Tigrinya terminology. Elders are abeti, are called abeti, which means the old ones, the big ones. And there's a lot of cultural connotations linked with this term. And one of these connotations is whatever question we have, if it's about the past, if it's the right moral behavior, it's about political questions, we have to ask them because they know. That's the narrative behind it. If we then look at the elders, we find an entire variety of elders who just have never been interested in anything related to the past, who just want to chat about other friends and whatever, and they would even almost not remember the history which they were taught by their own elders. They will say, when I was young, I was not interested. Even now, I was not interested. So this ideal of an elder knowing everything in practice is quite different. But we do have a number of elders who took them over this kind of role, fulfilling the expectation. And some elders are more or less specializing in historiography. Other elders are specializing in local law, local legal traditions. Sometimes they are interlinked, and sometimes they are the same person. Others are especially genealogical experts. Others, again, are especially experts in negotiation. For example, negotiation about family conflicts and similar. So you see, by fact, a number of capacities developed by these elders over the decades of their life. And when I ask these elders, they explain me how they did it. And there's an important element. Why what they do is not just based on an individual process and an individual interest, but on a process which is formed and let's say almost decided by society. The elder starts to be an elder, we can say, as a child, the knowledgeable elder. There are children who run after specific knowledgeable elders, others rather not, and they're encouraged, not so much as very young children, but the more they know, the more these elders would enjoy them telling their stories. And what is interesting here, normally you first tell sort of the official stories, the simplified narratives to the curious children, sometimes about a hero, sometimes about the genealogy. And there is usually a huge set of simplified narratives, which are sort of the public narratives, which are giving the main ideas about what is important about the past, be it family history, the history of the land, or of land ownership, or settlement history. Then some of these younger ones, they ask again and again. They want to hear the story again and again, and suddenly, and that's the interesting process, the story is changing. The same elder will tell another story. An example, for example, he will tell the genealogy of his family. So there is an important ancestor, the father of that important ancestor, another important ancestor. It's a short line. Suddenly, when there is more asking, and these younger people are showing a capacity of memory, of memorizing, the line totally changes. The same names appear, but for example, one person who was called the father of another one suddenly has 4 generations in between, which were never mentioned before in the simplified versions. And some of the persons in between may be women. There may be 3 women in between. So the father of the one is suddenly the great-great-grandfather through a female line. But that was an important great-grandfather who was supposed to be memorized. So this is to be remembered. So this is just an example. This is true for almost all oral narratives about the historical past. There's a simplified public narration, which is a sort of basis, serving as a sort of basis, and the much more detailed narratives. And that is why it is so horrible when I see archaeologists going to a site and asking the locals, tell me the history of the site. I repeat, it is horrible. Sometimes they get some story which is quite close to what is really told locally. Very often that's the, let's say, simplified childish version, which everyone is supposed to know. And this is historically interesting, but that's not what we are looking for. That's not what is preserved by the knowledgeable elders. So we have the most grotesque stories created by archaeologists due to this very naive approach to oral historiography. Some archaeologists, understandably, simply reject local legends. They say, why should we listen to these children's stories? Others have understood that these societies, especially these societies, these peasant societies in this very ancient northern Ethiopia, they have understood that they have systems of preservation of sometimes extremely detailed historical narratives. So they ask someone, tell me the history of that place. Example, Aksum. Those who have visited Aksum as researchers or tourists, they know that there is the famous palace of the Queen of Saba. Perfect example. This Queen of Saba palace did not exist before the 1960s. That's a very good example of the creation of public narratives. In fact, this was a site which had not been linked with strong oral traditions, according to our research in Aksum. But when it was different from other sites around, which have sometimes linked with very detailed traditions, but when it was excavated, the first attempts were earlier, but in the 1960s, there was the real discovery of that site. Then first tourists came and guides were looking for floating traditional narratives about the history, and then said, of course, that's a big palace. Of course, it is the palace of the Queen of Saba, because we don't have a site of the palace of the Queen of Saba or Sheba. So that must it be. Basically, it's a tourism story. It's a story created for tourists. Then an archaeologist came and he said that as there are very ancient traditions related to sites, the local people must be right and tell something important. And he made an excavation in the center of the, this is recent, just a little bit more than a decade ago. He made an excavation in the center of the palace of the Queen of Saba and found, according to him, the place where the Ark of Covenant was hidden in the past. So you see the trap. This is all fantasy. Fantasy because of a misunderstanding of these simplified stories, which have their own reasons, but which as such are not very good sources. The elders themselves know that. So what I tell you, I have it partially from the elders themselves. A number of other archaeologists also were a little bit scandalized because there are findings of coins and of other elements in this palace structure, which all show that this is about 6th century AD, if I remember well. We can check the details, but around that time. So there is well more than 1 millennia difference gap from the period which is Ethio-Sabaic, which we may identify as the period of the Queen of Saba, which again, neither archaeologically nor historically can be proven in her existence. So this example is just to show you the traps, but the elders, as I said, are aware of it, and they like to talk about it. And I have observed this process, which is quite interesting, Because when elders are asked about the detailed history, other elders sit there usually. Elders may tell the narrative by themselves, alone, individually, to interested partners. But again and again, there are situations where all of them are sitting together, and the other elders will also listen and say, no, you remember the genealogy slightly wrongly. The name was slightly different. It was not, for example, Wolbert Georgis, it was Gabriel Georgis, or whatever. So this is just an example. Or the exact line may be slightly different. The three brothers may be two brothers and a cousin, and things like that. We all deal with all these details as archaeologists do when they look at the layers and at the strata. We have to look at every single element, including we have to look at the mistakes and the contradictions. And now that's exactly also what these oral historiographers do. They compare each other's stories, and usually there is different layers of memory. Usually the one who is, according to public opinion, the one who has committed a mistake, he will check again his memory and say, usually it's he. That's why I don't say she, just a short footnote. But women also play a role, which we may discuss later, but another role in it. But here I'm speaking of the very typical male-based system. So these persons will check each other, and then the person who had, for example, a slip of a tongue or some unclear memory will check his own memories. So you see, on the one hand, a dynamic process, which is of course producing mistakes, especially over the centuries. On the other hand, a very strong checking system, because there's also different groups, age groups, which are involved. An elder at the age of 80 may very strongly correct the one who's 60, but sometimes also the other way around. And they will quote their sources. That's also what is very, very interesting. They, in the simplified narrative, they never mention who told them. But in the detailed narrative, they would mention the grandfather of a specific knowledgeable lineage, which is known for their capacity and their tradition of historical narrations, and would use them as a source. So if there are contradictions, they would also discuss them heavily, including comparing their sources. And there are a number of mnemotic systems of memory, including verses, specific vocabulary, sort of key terms, which allow people to remember the key elements of a story. So sometimes the wording slightly changed, but the keywords are known by everyone. So the mnemotic systems are not simply how to memorize long texts in your mind, which also happens, but also how to remember short elements of a story and then reconstructing it based on these elements. In some cases, we can observe through the comparison of stories, which are slightly different, that the keywords are the same. And that's again interesting because this helps us methodologically to reconstruct the key words and the key ideas of a story. So sometimes the comparison of these stories, and even the elders do that, the comparison of the stories will allow us what had been added. The small differences are likely to be either have all been added, sometimes all have been added, as a sort of flesh to the skeleton of the story. But through the comparison, we will know which were the key ideas, the key, let's say, narration structures of these oral historiographies. Enough for the moment. That's a complex story. I will go now through a number of examples. They are not absolutely complete, but I tried to list a number of categories which are very useful and which play a role in our ethnohistorical work. I say our, even if I'm the ethnohistorian, the only ethnohistorian in the archaeological team, but I'm working very much and more with local Ethiopian colleagues. One of my doctoral students, for example, is working on a specific region and the ethnohistorical reconstruction of their history. So we have more and more, especially younger people, younger, especially Ethiopian academics, who are working on such questions. As I said, it is a field which is just a sort of in the first phase of establishing itself. So first example, I mentioned already, I mentioned it just before, the category of genealogical accounts. That's something you find more or less in every northern Ethiopian society, also central Ethiopian, other Ethiopian societies, neighboring societies like the Somali society. So this is not an exception. This is the rule in the entire northeastern African region, that families and clans keep very, very, very detailed memories of their lineages. The absolute minimum usually, except in the cities where the system is becoming less and less important. But the essential idea is the essential genealogies are based on the idea of remembering 7 generations, 7 generations. You have to remember the father, his father, the father before, and so on until 7. This has a lot of reasons. Just to mention a short reason, without a main reason very shortly. Within these 7 generations in the Tigrayan society, everyone is considered brother and sister, with all what it means. They cannot marry each other, it would be incestuous. Even if an ancestor is shared 6 generations ago, imagine it is centuries back, you cannot marry because you're brother and sister. As you're belonging to a close set, a set of a close family, you have to help each other in times of danger, in times of suffering, and in times of famine, for example. That's one reason why in this society, which is usually in centuries under strong economic pressure, also with famines popping up from time to time, especially in times of political crisis like now, these social political systems help the people to survive because of this very strong obligations created by genealogical links. So genealogical accounts are not simply remembered for the sake of the beauty of remembering ancestors which are long dead. It has an effect on the organization of the society today. And here, this is a good example how it works. If another lineage comes and says, we belong to your lineage, maybe that's a lineage which is suddenly extremely poor, which has lost all properties, and they want to declare themselves relatives of a rich lineage. Of course, there's interest because this poor lineage would like to be related to them in order to get saved, to get help. However, now we have to think of the system of elders, which I just mentioned. One elder may even like them. Maybe there's a friendship relation. So the elder will say, I remember my great-grandfather had mentioned that he had a brother who went to that village of these poor people, so they belong to us. The other elders will say, wait a moment, we knew that great-grandfather. He never mentioned that brother. You invented. You just want to help them. So tricking is not easy. What can, however, happen, I have it as a sort of exception. I don't think it is usual, but what can happen that if there's an interest of alliance between these lineages, which are not originally related, they may agree all together, we all remember that brother of that great-grandfather, which did not exist. So we do have the element of construction, also in the sense of the society agreeing on an historical fact, which is in fact a projection into the past based on current interests. Still even this we can sometimes find, because there are other lineages related to that one who may not agree, but who did not participate in the meeting, and they will say, we know that they are not related. So suddenly we have two versions of historical story, and you see that there's a contradiction. And with more material, you may be able to find out who tricked, which lineage tricked. In some cases, of course, you will never know. A subcategory are power lineages, which I show here. Power lineages are those lineages which are seen by the local population as lineages which are important for the organization of the political society. An example is Aksum. In Aksum, there are so-called 7 clans, and these 7 clans are those who traditionally, until the 1970s, so it's quite recent, had decided about anything regarding the politics of the polity, of the political entity called Aksum. We very often, when we study Ethiopia, we have the image that there was the king and the nobles under the king who were ruling and governing the country. In some areas, it's certainly true, also in the sense of exploitation. But very often, when we look into the details, it's absolutely not true. It's a narrative of a superstructure, which in fact, if we look into the local details, are interestingly different from what we first think. We look into these superstructures, and we see that often these governors have a local counterpart from these power lineages, who in fact are sometimes extremely powerful. In the case of Aksum, it's quite an extreme example. By fact, it was a free city, which was legally under the emperor, but even the emperor's governor had to consult these local clans in order to take any decision which was not taken in consultation with these local power lineages was simply not valid. There's a lot of examples for that, but this is just to show you to which degree these very local power lineages are really influential. Another category are socio-political practices. So far, I have been talking a lot about historical memories, for example, genealogical memories. But a number of social practices are also clearly a reproduction of earlier practices. So there is no narrative or even no strong narrative linked with them, but there is a practice. And one of the practices is the Baito practice, the practice of a specific village community to sit together at a specific place. So there's also a space dimension. There's always a specific space where people assemble in order to meet and discuss political issues, economic issues, sometimes also family issues, sometimes judicial issues, penal issues. For example, if someone did a crime, usually there would also be such an assembly. So there is a sort of list of topics which have to be discussed in this framework. There's no narrative, no book in which it is described, or no law which says this is how we have to do it. Simply everyone knows it, and every generation follows that example. So we are also looking into these social, legal, as I call it, customs of self-regulation of local society, which again, I remind what I said in the beginning, which is very typical for societies in a partial absence of the state, in the absence of a strong state, which is typical for traditional Ethiopia, where there's a narrative of a strong state, but a practice of a weak state within which local communities have developed very refined systems of power sharing, of negotiation, and of common decision making. So there's an even democratic element, which during the last 100 years in some regions of Ethiopia had been downgraded step by step in the name of modernization of the state. So we do have, that's just a side remark, not the main topic of this talk, but we do have a system of de-democratization of the Ethiopian state in the course of modernization, which was a process of centralizing power in the name also of strengthening the state, which was in fact undermining local customs of self-regulation, which were often highly complex. Just to mention an example, they were, for example, systems of judgment where never one person could give a judgment, but had to be controlled by another lineage who had to participate in the judgment. So even a judgment, which is traditionally under the task of a governor, could not be done by that governor if he had not consulted specific members of legal families, of power lineages. So all of it was always a process of power sharing. This we can observe in the local societies to a very strong degree. Now to the next category. I now give you a number of examples. The category of social-political practices. Again, I have the same category, but another subcategory, the perpetuation of the political use of space. That's quite interesting. Very often, over a very, very long time, it is always the same site which is linked with a specific practice. What you see here is Gratba al-Gabri, which is one of the main archaeological sites in Yaha. And I will not tell you the entire legend, but the local story calls it the seat of the local government. And I was able to reconstruct some of the local practices linked with tax paying, which in fact is the original function of the site according to local practice. I don't speak of legend, I speak of an established practice linked with that site. Now the excavation went further and further, and by now the archaeological record is quite clear that this was a site in Ethio-Sabian times which was linked to government structures and less linked with cultic structures. So it was not a temple, to be clear about it, which fits perfectly to the practice which we have in the local memory linked with that site until quite recent times. Now, the next category, legends. I mentioned that word already several times. This is not a couple. This is a mother and her son, both very old. He almost 80, she in her 90s, who both remembered very detailed legends linked with the site which I just mentioned before. Among them, for example, a sort of magical machine producing a specific kind of stones. We are still working on that, but quite a number of cases, these very mythical stories which are linked with magical powers can also shed a light on the original function of a site. The other image you see people, young people telling me about what the general public knows about space organization, including about where spirits are sitting, and this is why such things are interesting, where spirits are sitting and which areas are free from spirits. Interestingly, what we see that those sites linked with spirits are not really archaeological sites. I leave the interpretation to you. In some cases, the stories on the spirits are very detailed. I would not claim that they really explain us the function of a site, but they are an interesting addition, especially because spirits are linked with specific sites. So you have this legendary element, which however gives you not only a flavor, but to some degree an understanding on how people understood a site. And sometimes we have elements which suggest that this was linked with original functions of a site. Another quite large field, I don't go into details, is the organization of space, and here the subcategory of toponyms. Everywhere I go, I look for the names of places, names of plains, names of hills, names of mountains. This is the surroundings of Yaha. So there you have Mokhwedi, you have Abigendefta, you have Lohutz, you have Imba Maiweni, you have Mai Meshal. So all these different terms. So what is interesting here is that sometimes the names carry an older meaning. I have observed that sometimes names have changed, but usually due to these nomadic practices, which are still very well known locally, people know a series of names of a place which changed over time. So we do not have only the toponym of today, but sometimes also older toponyms. An example here is Imba Maiweni. Weni can be, for example, simply interpreted as wine. It is the water of the wine. There's also some side meanings, but the connotations are about fertility, beauty, and so on. When you check, the original name is Maibarot. Maibarot means something very clear in Tigrinya. This is the area of the slaves. This is where the slaves were working. Slaves were considered in the old society, not surprisingly, as being socially, but also genealogically totally separated from the society. So sites linked with these slaves were seen as negative. So here you have a sort of rebranding. Why need to make it positive to kill the memory of this negative side of this site? And what is interesting now, if we check local practices and memories, as I told you, sites are very often linked with local practices and sometimes memories. This was a quarry site. This was a site of workers. So the toponym seems to be linked with that. Another subcategory are roots. I just mentioned it. Evidently, roots are partially simply a geographic reality. You would try to choose a route which is practical for your cattle, for your donkeys, for the transport of goods. So these routes tend to be extremely ancient. So I'm also trying to document today's routes in order to be able to reconstruct the possible connections between specific sites. This is a research in progress with a number of interesting examples. Still, organization of space, the subcategory borders. It's also highly interesting. Here we have a set of very different sources. Local practices of borders are so important because they are linked with property, with land property, extremely important for peasant societies. So this image that these non-European societies didn't have boundaries is just strange, in short, nothing more than strange, and nothing less than strange. Of course, we know that borders tend to be dynamic, but that was also the case in European society, and to some degree is still now. But we should not overestimate this dynamics. The control of space is very much linked with peasants' traditions and peasant structures and narratives of possession of land. So when the first European researchers arrived in these territories in the north, they documented the local political practices, the government areas of specific local lords and local power lineages, and put them on maps. And these maps are now extremely important. This is a map, for example, from 1857, showing the border region between Sudan, today's Eritrea, and Tigraj. Interestingly, a part of these borders are very similar to today's borders, which are considered to be modern, and in fact are much less modern than we think, simply because they are linked to territorial power structures, which are linked with the self-organization of peasant societies, which are extremely concerned about land organization, which also means about boundaries. No more details on this, but the next subcategory is directly linked with that, the subcategory of ethnic groups. You find pockets of ethnic groups within the main group. For example, Tigraj, we do not have just the Tigrinya speakers. We have subgroups speaking sometimes different languages all over Tigraj, but the space they're using is sometimes different. which is sometimes, in some cases, a difference of economic focus, economic activities. Sometimes they are linked with specific ancient roots. So specific roots are linked with other ethnic groups than, for example, the higher lying lands of peasants. So this multitude of ethnic groups and subgroups is again an interesting indication, and in some cases based on their ancient settlement patterns, which you can find in local traditions. Sometimes they're 100 years old, sometimes much older. Sometimes they are witnesses of an ancient trade route where specific groups were always going back and forth. I already mentioned shortly the cultural spiritual practices. I mentioned spirits linked with sites. This is now an example. Here I have an example, a spiritual practice linked with the perpetuation of power systems. This is the ruin of a castle in western Tigray, in fact in Mazaga. And this castle had been founded about 300 years ago by a Tigrayan lord who was confirmed in his power in that region by the kings of Ethiopia. That's quite interesting because here we have an element of history of a reorganization of power during the last 300 years, which happened in Western Tigray. Now, what is the perpetuation of power systems, which I observed? Interestingly, the local population goes to that castle with araki. There's no ruler anymore. There is no concrete power structure on that castle anymore. But there's the local narrative that this powerful overlord who had put the entire region under his control, this Tigrayan overlord called Abanazgi, this overlord had ordered the regular tributes to him. And after his death, they continued because they said his powerful spirit is still there. So until today, on specific days of the year, the local peasant population is bringing food and araki to that ruin. Why do I call it a perpetuation of power systems? But because through the practice, this overlord is remembered, and the meaning which is behind the power system represented by that overlord is transmitted from generation to generation. So through the spiritual practice of offerings, every population, every peasant population remembers that we are under that Tigrayan overlord, which in fact is simply an expression of the local idea of belonging to a system of confederacies of Tigrinya-speaking lords. Through such local practices, this is well remembered, while they also know that this castle and the lord was under the king of kings of Ethiopia. So it is both enhancing the Ethiopianness, because basically it's a border region. So it's enhancing the Ethiopianness in the sense of a perpetuation of Ethiopia as political space to which they belong, but also a perpetuation of the alliance to this Tigrayan overlord who had founded this governorate in the sense of one of many Tigrinya-speaking regions, which were linked usually in forms of confederacy, not in the sense of a totally unified space, but in the sense of political confederacies. Now to the last two examples, still cultural spiritual practices, the perpetuation of cultic knowledge. It's a very interesting example, which I found quite recently in my research. The idea that ancient cults of ancient religions are often renamed and reused by more modern religions. This idea is very well known. We know, for example, that the monastery of Deberdamu in central Tigray, which is a very ancient Christian monastery, had been founded on a site, on a pre-Christian site, which is suggested by archaeological findings which are clearly pre-Christian. We have a number of such ideas in a number of sites. In a number of cases, we do have the proof. For example, the Church of Yeha, which you saw in the very first picture of my talk. On that picture, you saw the church, in fact, in the compound of the Ethiopian temple. So here you have also a publication of a cult site through changing religions. What I found here is interesting. I found that this site, which is the site of Ade Akaweh near Wugro in eastern Tigray, on this site there were, besides legends, also an interesting cultic practice. The entire local Muslim population, which according to their own traditions are descendants of ancient economic groups, traders groups, going back and forth, assuring the connection between outside territories, the Red Sea, and the kingdoms in Ethiopia. According to their own tradition, they tell a lot of details about their function of moving back and forth and connecting these inner Ethiopian territories with the outside world. Now, what is interesting, these people did not have a mosque. It was a majority, by majority, a Christian kingdom, a Christian area. But they had their prayers, their Friday prayers, and the muezzins call for prayer exactly on the site of the Ethiopian temple. I don't go into more details here. This is just an example. This site had been closed probably as a majority society, and when the religion was not used anymore or not accepted anymore as the dominant religion, it was closed, it was sort of buried. This is what I suggest as what has happened. But what I found interesting is that a local subgroup, today Muslims, still continued their cult exactly on that side, while no objects were there. It was just a hill linked with some legends, which are negative legends among Christians and positively charged legends among the Muslim group. So we see that subgroups are sometimes also interesting. Not only majority groups, but subgroups are sometimes continuing cults on sites which are officially, according to the majority society, not in use anymore. Last example, we are now basically going out of the talk. It's an outlook into what happens now. It's the example of museums. Museums are totally modern, of course, in Ethiopia. Now museums are popping up everywhere. We are also, colleagues are part of the process of creating new museums. On the right, you see an old building of a governor, which had been redesigned as a local museum, and the Museum of Aksum, in fact, with some archaeological excavation. So this is again a new means. Let me simply call of keeping an old tradition, the tradition of memory, the tradition of creating historical reference systems. So the modern society, the modern state is also using modern methods in order to integrate the historical narratives in it. And now another example is the Arabic inscription stone. As I mentioned, the Arabs have an ancient presence in the region. In fact, the most ancient in any country in the world, starting from the times of Prophet Muhammad. And such kind of objects, not only Christian objects, are kept in local churches and by now, step by step, transferred to local museums. And the question, however, remains open to which degree these local museums will be submitted to a very official narrative coming from a center, or will be able to play a role in the preservation of local knowledge and local practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wolbert, for such an interesting presentation that we can obviously see that ethnographers as well as ethnohistorians, as in your case, are an important part of archaeological groups on archaeological sites. So I open now the space for discussion.
Hello, good afternoon. Can I start with a question? Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. And I have been working in the Middle Nile Valley, so it's in the same region, but a totally different culture and tradition. And I came across many times about information that women in local societies are the holders of the traditions and also some oral histories, oral traditions. How it looked like in your research area, because you mentioned men, the elders, but do women also have that kind of institution and that kind of people who just pass this information? Thank you.
May I directly answer? Yeah, that's an important question. And as you have seen in my talk, I had already hinted at this problem. And I say it's a problem because especially in the field of historiography and historical and political narratives and practices, there is a real male domination. But a male domination doesn't mean that the women don't play a role, and I will explain. And I hoped that in the discussion, we will be able to discuss exactly that point, because every research has different phases. So in the first phase, you will rather encounter the shortened, simple narratives, which I mentioned, which are a trap, if you want. Sometimes they're precious, but they are a trap. Among them is also the trap that men decide everything and know everything. That's also a trap. In the second phase of the research, you will find these oral historiographers and also people knowing local practice very well, and where you just come very close to detail. Sometimes it's still broken fragments. You will not be able to reconstruct the original narrative, but still it is extremely male dominated. They are the ones who talk. And very often I have then asked the wife sitting besides this oral historiographer, and sometimes also waiting until the man goes away and ask her some questions innocently, if she knows something. And it was interesting, very often the wives could not answer. So I thought, okay, maybe that's really a male thing. But research as society is complex, so you move on. And what I find is quite interesting. More and more, I discover the role of women. But it's another layer again behind, and partially different. So it's true that this strong domination of the historiographical narrative, which is also a political narrative, is a male thing. Still, I found women who know a lot of details, but because they were interested and always listened to the historiographers in their family, they never talk first. And I must be really lucky that they're ready to tell it to me as a man. So there's even this kind of barrier. So I hope also for women entering into this kind of ethnohistorical research, because I'm sure this will open doors, which I'm not easily able to open. So this is the field of historiographical narrative, but practice, socio-political practice. Now suddenly we are really in the field of women. Not at first sight. Even the image which I showed you was mainly men sitting together, this image of this assembly, which is a socio-political practice. But we have a lot of assembly structures where the men are sitting, then some women in between and more women around. They are surveying the men. To give a concrete example, every week there's an assembly of specific village circles or village groups, or we can call them clubs. We can use such modern terms. It's not so wrong. And men come together, discuss everything, what is important within their group, family matters, political matters also. And then they're eating and drinking beer. The women sit with them. But what did the women do? They came days before and were cooking together, discussing all the issues among themselves. This is a social-political practice. When the men assemble, they have already talked with their women and they know the news, and the women have told them what the important questions are. So here you have a very interesting element of influence, which is definitely ancient. And last point, I checked these genealogies, and the simplified genealogy is usually the one which only mentions men. The complex one has a lot of female lineages, including female rulers who are ruling in the name of a weak husband, for example. This exists, weak husbands. I mean, we know it exists. It's very well known, but history doesn't want to remember it. But it does, because the strong women are highly respected by the society. And I'm trying to trace it more and more. And I find that these women are often also extremely knowledgeable in local poetry, including political poetry. So this is what I found, that the women very often remember a huge set of oral literature, which is a necessary addition to this research. Thank you. Important question.
Okay, the next one was Professor Rubinkowska that raised her hand.
Actually, Joanna was the first, so yeah.
No, I don't
she was
think so. No, I wasn't for sure. So please, Hania, go on.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Wolbert. Okay, Wolbert. First of all, thank you very much. It was brilliant, and I think it's now more and more obvious for us how much this let's call it Oriental studies, how we call it, so ethnology, among others, are necessary for archaeologists. So this, which is the key idea of the project. So I think it's very important also in this respect for us. But not to talk too much, I would like to ask you the question about this oral historiographers. How much are they the opposition towards the state or the central power?
Excellent question. I would say in general, they are the supporters of the state, but really in general. So they are also the ones who remember the big stories which keep the state together. So, for example, the story of the foundation of the Ethiopian dynasty through Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, or the Nigiste Saba. So they carry on the main narratives of the state itself. However, they also remember all the stories which justify local power and local self-organization. So they are full of stories of resistance. The stories of resistance are not stories of resistance against a power-abusing state, but against invaders. Invaders can come from anywhere. They can come from Italy. They can come from the Arab states, from Egypt. They can be a neighboring ethnic group. They can be the central state. So the narrative structure is not a structure which has an idea of resistance as such, but there's the structure of, let's say, there are others who do not respect our local rights. And if this happens, we have the duty of resistance. And this kind of other can be fulfilled by anyone, including the state itself. So if a state is attacking the local autonomous structures, let's say attacking it in a too quick way, because attack always happens. Sometimes it's a positive attack in the sense of reform and modernization, which also sometimes leads to resistance. So this is not only about resistance of local people who are right against something wrong. It's local people defending the structures known to them and preserved by them against something coming from outside, which is too quick, too powerful, which may interrupt their system. So resistance against anything which is too powerful and has effects on these local structures. So in this sense, you see, it has two possible sides. These elders can play a very, very important role in the support of the state, but they can also play a very important role in resisting against superstructures imposed by the state.
Thank you very much. But if I may add one more point to this, are you aware of any actions, let's say, by the government that would deal with this oral historiography. I mean, through media, for example, to show that some groups are right, some others are wrong, for example, that to show that some of the groups, they support central government with oral historiography, and to show that others are, I don't know, maybe terrorists because they spread wrong news. Is anything like this? I mean, I'm asking about how much central government now at the moment in Ethiopia is aware of the possible danger of this institution.
I think we have to go back even 50 years. This is something which we saw to some degree starting from the Haile Selassie period. Before, I'm not aware of it simply, but that was not my focus of study. So I know about a number of examples. The central institutions of the state have never focused much on it. They have used sometimes these local elders to praise the state, which has its own influence, but very often elders also say, you can always pick someone who's praising, giving him money or so. It will not have a strong influence of us if we don't agree within our group. So this kind of things have been used, including also local songs. Meles Zenawi himself has used it, people creating songs praising the government. It has its influence, but it should maybe not be overestimated. Another influence by the state is, however, very strong, and it's indirect. It's modern schooling. In the modern schooling system, young pupils are usually told that they are learning modern knowledge, and that much of the stories told by the elders are linked with poverty. I mean, I know it from local teachers. However, this is not a centrally taken decision. It's a process. It's part of the process of modernization, that some of the more ancient knowledge is simply undermined. And basically, I don't think they know what they are doing. It's just a side effect of this modern schooling system, which I think would be good to look at again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Joanna?
Oh, yes, thank you very much for your really extremely interesting talk. Well, I'm doing research on ancient Indian texts, very ancient, which began the oldest were composed in 13th century BCE. But what is more important now in this context is that they were transmitted only orally for more than 1,000 years. So I found it very interesting what you were talking about oral transmission. It was, but it was not only the only thing I found very interesting. I also very much liked your saying that you take narrative system as a point of reference, and if you agree, I will steal it from you, this saying, because this is the problem in Indology, that these very old texts are treated by Indologists as just mythology, and that real philosophy and real India began in somehow 6th or 4th BCE, and earlier texts are just. But it is the point of reference for the whole culture till today. So, well, and I am doing also, I am reading this text with aid of cognitive linguistics methodology. So I was also very happy to hear that you will also cross the boundaries. And I know how it is difficult sometimes when you meet more traditional researchers, let's put it like this. But I have also a question. You were mentioning these people, it was on slide, I don't remember, between 4th and 7th, I think, but the very old people who, it was a man and a woman, and they remember a lot of stories, ancient stories, but I was also interested, do they also tell the stories from their own life, because they lived so long, they have lived so long, so they have to remember, I mean not have, but they probably remember a lot of interesting events and so on. And how do do they want to talk about it? Do they find it interesting and so on?
Thank you so much. On your remark, just another remark to strengthen it. We do need to see a number of written texts as products of oral interaction. And we need much more discussion on that, but we have oral elements, we have these verses which are very often transmitted over many generations as in fact mnemotic devices.
Yes.
And because they are verses, they can be remembered over a very, very long time. So what is written at the end is usually a product of interaction. And even after having been written, the oral stories continue. So I have, for example, conflicts between a written text and oral stories. The oral stories are more detailed than the written one. And the oral stories are competing, in a sense, with the written text and saying the written text is the one which is wrong, because we are the ones who have preserved the oral history, and the written text is simply a power-based falsification. Finally, I found another text from that time, which was corresponding to the oral tradition, which made the claim by the oral historiographers very strong that the written text is the falsification. So we have here quite interesting interactions. So this is just a short comment that I think this is also an important question for the future, including for philologists, to see these written texts not only as sort of closed systems, but they are part of a vivid practice, which includes oral practice. They are not only the products of it, but even as written text, they stay part of an oral practice. On your question, yes, I did ask such questions. It would be good to have someone really focusing on this question. Basically, there's too many research projects waiting. But I observed, and I found it a bit surprising that many of these elders just do not want to tell much about themselves. Even it's not seen as very good to talk a lot about own experiences. This is a typical city thing. Individual ex-politicians belonging to the modern state in the cities, they do this, and sometimes it's very impressive. But if I go to the villages, I ask them for their title, they say, I'm this and this. Then I want to know about the title. Then they very shortly say, I have this and this function, or this and this task. That's it. Then I ask them, did you witness the Italian occupation? Yes, I witnessed. And it's quite surprising. It's very difficult to go into details. When you ask them, however, about the creation of their lineage and their relation with a specific office and land claims, immediately there's an avalanche of information. And sometimes within this avalanche of information, they themselves appear because they can, sometimes they mention, then I was in that and that meeting and I could claim the land because I remember the exact genealogy, how we are related to the original owner of that land. So such success stories do appear, but rather linked with the older narratives.
I'm not surprised, frankly speaking. Somehow it is the same in India too, with the Brahmins who still remember the text, and they really can recite a lot of texts by heart, and they are more somehow immersed in text. They are part of the text and this oral culture much more than part of what is going on now. So thank you very much. And one more thing which was very interesting for me, it was how the space is organized, because that is somehow the part of our project, and all these aspects you mentioned, all these are not aspects, but that there are different ways of organizing space, and it was also very interesting. So really, thank you once again very much.
Thank you very much. The next person to ask a question was Daniel.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor, for this extremely fascinating lecture. It was really amazing to see all these things, especially I'm an Egyptologist, and from ancient Egypt we have so little of the oral tradition left, and these practices are like not really described. I mean, they are not really described, so we're trying to guess at the details, the mechanisms, the roles, the outcomes of these things. So from time to time it's very interesting to see some examples which might be somehow in some sense, of course, parallel ancient societies as well. So thank you very much. One thing that came to my mind when thinking about these elders who have this really detailed knowledge about the past, it's very interesting that you say that they don't want to talk about themselves, if I understand it well. Yes, and isn't it a little bit like distancing themselves, like their persona and their role? So there is their persona, and there is the role of being this local library, kind of like, if I can put it, you know, in a way, there's like a professional thing, and they talk about the profession, but they distance their own persona from it somehow, and it only comes into the picture when it plays a role in the knowledge somehow that they are trying to protect. It's super interesting for me that they do this this distancing, but this is just something that came to my mind. What I really wanted to ask you about is that there was this example where there was this castle where a local Tigrinya ruler was, and people are still bringing offerings to it. And you said that it was somehow to perpetuate some sort of like a power structure, that they are under these Tigrinya rulers. And I was wondering, what does it give to the people who do these offerings? Like do they gain prestige by it, or do they put themselves in some sort of relation to other people by doing this gesture, by doing these rituals? And of course, because there was something like this in ancient Egypt as well. That's why I'm asking. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Unfortunately, now this is a war zone, so this is one of the questions which I wanted to deepen. My plan was already last year, my hope was, not my plan, but my hope was during the last 1.5 years, during the Corona period, to be there and go into more depth. Now Corona made it impossible. After that, the war made it impossible. I cannot give a really final answer, but what I have observed is that even local recent settlers, which arrived during the last 30 years, in comparison with those who arrived 100 years ago, or whose ancestors arrived 300 years ago, they all saw themselves, and this was very clear in the way they answered me and their storytelling. They all see themselves as part of the same process. So there's not the indigenous Tigrinya speakers and the invading Tigrinya speakers, at least not in the interviews which I saw, but those who are rather the sons of recent settlers, or themselves are recent settlers, they're part of this process which had been started by that ruler in that time. So you have an ethnic component for sure. I don't know how strong it is. This would be one of the questions, now very difficult to answer, but very clearly, this reference to this ruler has two sides. One, everyone underlined that this was a Tigrinya ruler, a Tigrayan ruler. They even know his origin, and so this is very well preserved, which underlines the connection, which is not only ethnic, but a political connection to the other Tigrinya-speaking regions. Here, to be clear, this is usually not very well known. The Tigrinya-speaking regions are traditionally usually quite autonomous, also from each other. There is marriage linkages, political linkages. They may go to war together against an enemy due to an alliance, but they have usually their own government structures, including self-governed structures. Sometimes they are very different, sometimes more hierarchical, sometimes more democratic, if you want to use that term. And so you have a multitude of different territories, which are usually defined through their own founding histories. So here we see very clearly a founding history, a history which is on the one hand, defining it as a separate territory, on the other hand, as a territory linked with these territories from where this ruler had originated. So I see here a political function, and practically I could observe it with the presence of settlers, rather recent settlers, who all retell also the same history, which they learned from the older settlers. So it's also a story of integration of people with similar ethnic background.
I see. And what about the local elite, if we can call them like that? Do they? I presume they participate in this process.
Absolutely, absolutely. That was also part of my plan to document their genealogical narratives and their lineages. What I could see is that these local elites, they were Tigrinya speakers. They had strong connections to other Tigrinya-speaking territories, including marriage relations. Even there are specific territories, for example, Tembian, to which there are strong relations. At the same time, they entertained strong relations with the superstructures of the state, the King of Kings. Being in a border region, and I mentioned that aspect, but I have to mention it again, it is very important to keep sort of different parallel alliances. So one was the alliance with the state structure, the leading families of the state, which are more or less Amharic-speaking families, and the rather regional, local lineages and relations. Both were entertained in the same time. So, for example, priests, which very often belong to some local leading families, priests were sent to the Amharic teaching centers of Gondar, for example. So they were perfect Amhara speakers as the second language, which is part of the alliance. So there's not only a political, but also a cultural alliance. So now you see more and more details are mentioned, but you see that we clearly can say that the local traditions have multiple layers, reflecting alliances, power systems, but also systems to protect a certain degree of local security as a border region, which is always in danger of invasions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, Joanna.
Again, I'm sorry to, but it occurred to me when Daniel was speaking, and so I would like to ask you this question, which came to my mind, and maybe you told it, and somehow I didn't get it. I'm thinking about stories of women. Maybe they are more individual. I mean, they are more connected with what happens here and now, and not in this eternal time of they remember.
Yeah, let me answer. Many women say it a little bit like that. I mean, the wording would be a bit different, but even women explain to me sometimes why they don't know history. And they say, we have tasks, we have things to do, we have to care for the children, we have to look after the cattle, we have to look, we have to organize the children and the herding of the herds, which also the men do, but the women are looking after their small children and learning it, getting initiated into the process. So yes, that's one aspect. But interestingly, I have observed that especially women who are descendants of power lineages have a lot of knowledge about political alliances, especially genealogical alliances. Some women have virtually taken over the task of a female oral historiographer with specialization on family connections, which is again, not surprising for women, with an extremely detailed knowledge of genealogical connections and obligations resulting out of it, and possible alliances which could be based on it. I have witnessed it several times. One of them was the great-granddaughter of Emperor Johannes, a very traditional lady, not part of the big society, a very traditional lady, but she knew exactly whom to connect in which moment to get the alliance which was needed. So they can be very political in this sense, especially in the forming of alliances.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Hannah?
Just on the same subject, isn't it that women need this knowledge also to make connections, I mean, find right husbands, and so it's needed for this respect, apart of all the other things?
Thank you. Very practical question, because as I mentioned, the minimum knowledge you have to have is always about the 7 generations before you. Some lineages remember 20 generations, especially important influential lineages. They have a much deeper memory because positions are linked with it and specific land rights are linked with it. But women are supposed to remember minimum 4. at least in the societies or sub-societies which I studied. I would not generalize it. It may be different even within Tigray from region to region. But where I asked the question, I observed that a minimum of 4 is required, because if there is a relation through a female line, which is beyond 4 generations, they're not brothers and sisters anymore. But within 4 generations on the female line, they're brothers and sisters. That's one version which I saw. So yes, also this is important. The women are also checking lineages in order to discuss marriage issues, which are not discussed just by male elders. This is a really male and female issue, and they may work together. They may have also different ideas. Women can be extremely crucial in it. And if need be, the women will research all the 7 generations or even more. But I have also a colleague has done research and found in some more traditional societies, even on the female side, you have to remember 7 generations. My impression is, but I cannot prove it, that this depends a little bit on how influential the families are. If they are very influential, it seems that the genealogical depth which is required is much more pronounced than in other families, in the case of other families, which again means the role of women will be extremely important, because you have so many lineages and all of them go through at least one mother. Only one lineage goes through the fathers. All the others have at least one woman or quite a line of women in between. So without these women and their genealogical knowledge and their research capability, no chance to keep up the society as it is. So we do not have, to conclude, and this is a good example, we do not have a patriarchal society in the genealogical sense. That's just the first impression you get. But if you look into the practices behind, nothing works without the women, and it has concrete effects. Very often the family of the mother plays a very important role in cooperation, even in help, in aid, in situations of emergency, pressure, danger. It is the female lineages which will help you. And the mothers will tell you where are the cousins on the female side, which will save you, or which are simply your, let's say, mother side brothers.
Thank you very much.
Okay, are there any other questions? Well, if not, then thank you very much again for such an interesting presentation. And I hope that we'll be able to work together during our project, and looking forward to see you more often in Warsaw. Thank you very much all for participating.
Thank you for the invitation.
Enjoy this beautiful weather, I guess, still. Enjoy holidays. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.